The horror of philosophy and the expanse. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of the black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday, the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Part 1. The Horror of Philosophy. Philosophy is best read as a horror story. It's about showing us where the human meets the non-human. It's about showing us where the horizon of the conceivable meets the inconceivable. Studying philosophy turned out to be something far from what I had imagined it would be when I first started down this road. I began studying philosophy, imagining it as a quest towards certainty, as a journey that would illuminate to me the true and objective nature of the world. A world that would just so happen to align with my preconceived notions of reality, the good, and truth. I thought that studying philosophy would be like climbing a mountain. Sure, it'd be difficult and arduous, but you put one foot in front of the other for long enough, negotiate some obstacles along the way, and eventually you'd reach the top. From my summit, I thought I'd have an unobscured, pristine view of the world. I thought I could stand over and above reality to see what the world was in itself. I thought that when I got to the top of this mountain, I'd finally know. Instead, the journey I'd embarked upon was more like exploring endless dark caverns on a distant planet. Caverns filled with hazards beyond my imagination, and growing ever more mysterious and disorienting the deeper I explored. This sort of philosophical journey is what Eugene Thacker describes as the horror of philosophy in his book, In the Dust of This Planet, The Horror of Philosophy, Volume 1. This horror is the moments in which philosophy reveals its own limitations and constraints. Moments in which thinking enigmatically confronts the horizon of its own possibility. The thought of the unthinkable that philosophy cannot pronounce but via a non-philosophical language. Studying philosophy in a rather quick manner destroyed the foundations upon which I had constructed my conceptual world. At first, I was too scared to open my eyes and observe the looming shadow of the universe's ultimate inconceivability. Instead of confronting the abyss, I turned away and pretended the abyss wasn't there. I ran away from the notion that the world may be fundamentally incomprehensible. While not retreating all the way to the peace and safety of a new dark age, I most certainly responded to this horror with behavior I can now only describe as cowardice. Instead of recognizing the reality of my situation, I thought, or perhaps merely hoped, that a new, solid, and permanent foundation would present itself. I was constantly looking for some new grounding, some new bedrock that I could base all of my knowledge on. Eventually, the shortcomings and failures of that system would become clear and apparent, and I would abandon that system and replace it with a new one. As one could probably guess, or perhaps understand from personal experience, this sort of process easily could lead one to a sort of perpetual existential crisis. On the other side of this abyss, though, was a revelation, a deeper understanding that was a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. I realized that there was no bottom. There was no firm, unshakable foundation upon which I could build it all. And while Nietzsche was something that I had stumbled across later in my philosophical journey, the multi-year process of historicizing human thought and absolute truth that I experienced while learning philosophy was well summarized in the first line of Nietzsche's On Truth and Lie in a Non-Moral Sense. In some remote corner of the sprawling universe, twinkling among the countless solar systems, there was once a star on which some clever animals invented knowledge. It was the most arrogant, most mendacious minute in world history, but it was only a minute. After nature caught its breath a little, the star froze and the clever animals had to die. One could invent a fable like this and still not have illustrated sufficiently how miserable, how shadowy and fleeting, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect appears in nature. There were eternities in which it did not exist, and when it has vanished once again, it will have left nothing in its wake. For the human intellect has no further task beyond human life. Instead, it is merely human, and only its owner and producer regards it so pathetically as to suppose it contains in itself the hinge on which the world turns. If we could communicate with a mosquito, we would learn that it, too, flies through the air with the same pathos, feeling itself to be the moving center of the entire world. In short, studying philosophy was, for me, slowly discovering that the world we live in, while having some semblance of comprehensibility, will never be fully within our grasp. Philosophy shows you the horizons of human thought and the limits of reason itself. Part 2. The world, the earth, and the planet. The inhuman nature of the world, the awareness that we are sitting on the precipice of annihilation, is becoming more and more apparent. With the ever-looming threat of anthropogenic climate change set to radically change the world, and the contemporarily real threat of a pandemic, along with the inability or unwillingness of our political institutions to adequately address these threats, we are constantly confronted with the fact that the universe at large is fundamentally ambivalent towards us. We aren't guaranteed an existence. We, in a very real sense, are always living on borrowed time. This horrific thought is something that humans dedicate a great amount of energy towards ignoring. For Eugene Thacker, when the non-human world manifests itself to us in these ambivalent ways, more often than not, our response is to recuperate that non-human world into whatever the dominant human-centric worldview is at that time. Basically, for Thacker, we don't have a good way of talking about our confrontation with the unhuman universe. This often results in projecting an anthropomorphic trait onto the ambivalent and non-human universe in ways that are less than productive. In regards to climate change, Slavoj Žižek makes a similar observation in his book, In Defense of Lost Causes, in a larger point, attempting to convince the left to adopt his notion of emancipatory terror in response to the post-end of history's there is no alternative axiom for political thought. For Žižek, our way forward in ecology must understand that nature doesn't exist. Our existence is utterly groundless. We will never succeed in fully consummating the gap that separates the life world notion of nature and the scientific notion of natural reality. Nature, qua the domain of balanced reproduction, of organic deployment into which humanity intervenes with its hubris, brutally throwing its circular motion off the rail, is man's fantasy. Žižek thinks that imbued in this kind of ecology is a kind of conservatism, an implicit fear of any big radical change. As someone interested in emancipatory politics, one could easily see why Thacker thinks that arguably one of the greatest challenges that philosophy faces today lies in comprehending the world in which we live as both human and non-human, and of comprehending this politically. Another example, which some might find relatable, would be to think about Christianity. Most Christians think of God, angels, and demons in almost exclusively anthropomorphized terms, notwithstanding descriptions of the angels found in the Old Testament. Jesus himself is literally God, and he's also a man. Christians construe the order of the world within a moral economic framework of sin, debt, and the redemption of life after death. When faced with the natural disaster or personal hardship, it's not unusual to hear a Christian construe such events as all part of God's plan, the Lord works in mysterious ways. These are prime examples of how humans will recuperate the non-human world in anthropomorphic terms. Thacker finds these ways of thinking about the world remarkably unproductive He wants to offer up a new terminology in hopes that it will help us navigate this new space. His new vernacular is as follows: the world for us, the world in itself, the earth, and the world without us, the planet. The world for us is the world in which we live in as worldlings. This is the world in which we are embedded in and live in on a daily basis. The world is that which we as human beings interpret and give meaning to. The world that we relate to or feel alienated from. The world that we are at once part of and that is also separate from the human. This is the space in which we live our day-to-day lives. This is the world where we have friends, romantic partners, hobbies, political aims, etc., etc. If one is familiar with the works of Martin Heidegger, they might call this the world in which one is a being in the world. The world in itself, or the earth. This conception of the world is the one that we objectify, the one that we see as separate from us. The earth is the world that scientists are trying to discover facts about. The earth conceives of the world as an object that we stand over and above. It is the world of geology, meteorology, biology, etc. This world is an ever-expanding horizon that science tries to expand further, only to have new boundaries pop up as soon as we close in on the last. Then there's the world without us, the planet. The planet is quite literally a planet. It is one planet among other planets, moving the scale of things out from the terrestrial into the cosmological framework. This planet is in a sense unthinkable to us or beyond our typical horizons. It represents the subtraction of the human from the world. This is the thought of some asteroid wiping out all human life, and the fact that this very thing in which we find the world moves on when the world ceases to exist. Thacker doesn't stop after introducing a few new words. He also suggests that we explore other avenues by which humans have talked about and confronted the unhuman. One of the first areas which he examines is the genre of supernatural or cosmic horror. Thacker writes, "The genre of supernatural horror is a privileged site in which this paradoxical thought of the unthinkable takes place. What in an earlier era would have been described through the language of darkness mysticism or negative theology, our contemporary era thinks of it in terms of supernatural horror. Lovecraftian horror is a classic example of this genre, but as I hope to use a more contemporary example, as well as one less encumbered by racism, I want to use James S.A. Corey's novel series, The Expanse. This series has also been adapted into a very popular Amazon Prime original, which I would also recommend. I believe this series can illustrate ways in which humans deal with a universe that is largely beyond our understanding, and I believe that this series can show how the inhuman world could bite back if we don't figure out a better way to talk about it and understand our place within it. Part 3, The Expanse. Spoilers ahead for the first book of The Expanse, Leviathan Wakes, and Season 1 of the show. The Expanse is set in a near-future world that, in many ways, is politically and economically identical to our current world. Around the mid to late 21st century, in response to a significant climate crisis, the UN took its place as a mostly unified political hegemon on Earth, a la Fukuyama's End of History. This is a world very much still immersed in capitalist realism. Shortly after the UN's ascension to political hegemon, the colonization of the solar system began with colonists journeying to Mars. These Martian colonists, after 3 generations, began to assert their independence from Earth rule. Luckily for the inhabitants of both planets, as both planets had sizable navies and countless nuclear warheads, they managed to do so without violence. Fortuitously, a Martian named Solomon Epstein invented a new type of engine drive that traveled much further, much faster, with less fuel. In lieu of war, Mars offered up this new technology to the UN in exchange for their sovereignty. Soon thereafter, the race for colonizing and extracting resources from what would be known as the Belt, the asteroids and moons of Jupiter and Saturn, began. By the time Leviathan Wakes begins, sometime in the vicinity of the year 2350, there are between 50 and 100 million people, depending on who's doing the counting, living on the space stations, asteroids, and dwarf planets further from the sun than Mars. This population is dwarfed by the 4 billion people living on Mars and the 30 billion living on Earth. These people living in the furthest reaches of civilization are called belters, and are certainly victims of racism from the, quote, inners, both interpersonally and, more importantly, systemically. While Earth and Mars share a contentious yet civil rivalry for system leader, they are both united in their brutal exploitation of the resources and people living outside the gravity wells of their respective planets. Belters complete dangerous and backbreaking labor in the service of Earth and Mars corporations on meager wages in a place where even their air is a commodity. They live on stations owned by inner corporations, have their laws enforced by private security corporations owned by inners. They have effectively zero political capital and no realistic means of redress with the political institutions that govern their lives. The class dynamics between the belters and the inners would be a great topic to cover, but are certainly beyond the scope of this video. At some point just prior to the start of the series, the first object of extrasolar origin was discovered and deemed the proto-molecule. It was named as such after the corporation that made the discovery, Protogen, an event described in the books in the following terms. They had no idea what it does, but they slapped their label on it like they'd made it. All they could think to do was brand it. The protomolecule is not a living organism, but more like a virus, and is obviously the creation of beings far beyond the technological capacity and intelligence of humans. It caught the interest of human scientists for its ability to maintain its primary structure in a wide variety of conditions through secondary and tertiary changes. Its activity suggested it was not itself a living thing, but a set of free-floating instructions designed to adapt and guide other replicating systems. Protomolecule, when it touches living organisms, breaks them down and repurposes their structures in accordance with its programming. The scientists believe that it was sent to Earth to hijack all early life forms to redirect their matter towards the completion of some unknown end around 2 billion years ago. Out of an accident or oversight on the part of its builders, the protomolecule ended up getting caught in the orbit of Saturn and never made it to its intended destination. So, how exactly does all of this fit in with Thacker's notion of horror, and more specifically, the world, the Earth, and the planet? As mentioned above, when the protomolecule comes into contact with life forms, it doesn't, strictly speaking, destroy them. It's not like a nuclear explosion that would reduce a life form to their component atoms. The protomolecule repurposes life forms and their replicating structures. The protomolecule, in a sense, turns a person into something that is both human and non-human. The protomolecule represents a fusion of the world and the planet. The protomolecule, and more importantly its builders, are in themselves a stark representation of a world and a universe at large that is beyond anything that is human. Had the protomolecule made it to its destination, all life on Earth, as far back as the creation of photosynthesis, would have simply been repurposed and never came into existence. From the standpoint of a civilization that had the ability and desire to create such a tool, what we know as the world was only a planet. It was only a tool. I'd imagine an analogous relationship would be the one seen between us and yeast. While we recognize that yeast is a life form, to us it is simply a sort of stored energy that is to be unleashed when we desire it. I keep a jar of yeast in my fridge, and when I wish to make a loaf of bread, I call upon it. Someone like Martin Heidegger would call this a standing reserve. When the builders of the protomolecule wanted to harness the biological matter of our planet, they threw some protomolecule our way, the way I will throw some yeast in a jar and pour warm water on it before I mix it in with flour and salt. Hey, seriously, spoilers ahead. As one could easily predict, Humans coming into possession of such a piece of technology would quickly result in disaster. It doesn't take long for experiments with this technology to turn into genocide-level events for certain populations. Said event quickly deteriorates into the potential to reach an extinction-level event for all life in the solar system. Humans, when faced with this blatant threat of the world without us, can only capitalize on it in terms that are human, all too human. The people involved with these heinous crimes stared into the void. They confronted the inhumanity of the universe and acted just as Thacker described. They recuperated that non-human world into whatever the dominant human-centric worldview was at that time. If you're the head of a giant megacorp like Protogen, you'll be compelled to recuperate the non-human world into some profitable commodity. If you're a military officer, you will recuperate the non-human world into a weapon of war the likes of which humanity has never seen. What else could one expect from humans who come into contact with such a piece of technology, one that is light years beyond their comprehension? In Book 3 of the series, Abaddon's Gate, the resulting disasters from such hubris are described in the following terms. It killed humans, therefore it was a weapon. But radiation killed humans, and a medical X-ray machine wasn't intended as a weapon. Holden was starting to feel like they were all monkeys playing with a microwave. Push a button, a light comes on inside, so it's a light. Push a different button and stick your hand inside, it burns you, so it's a weapon. Learn to open and close the door, it's a place to hide things. Never grasping what it actually did, and maybe not even having the framework necessary to figure it out. No monkey ever reheated a frozen burrito. Part 4. Conclusion. The Expanse shows us a world which is foreign yet familiar in how we as humans wrestle with the horror of the world without us. It shows us the failings and shortcomings in how we respond when the planet comes creeping in on the world. It shows us the dire threat this inability of ours creates. The stakes here are high. As we struggle through the COVID-19 pandemic, our inability to have a coherent understanding of our world while being confronted with the planet is abundantly clear. As infection rates soar into the millions and the strength of our medical infrastructure is being pushed to its limits, politicians, business persons, and citizens alike rally behind the cries of "Save the economy." Here, we can observe capitalist realism in full force with a retreat into a fantasy world where everything will be fine as long as the holy line keeps going up. I can think of no better contemporary example of the danger hidden in recuperating the non-human into an all-too-human framework. That being said, there is no simple way forward. At this point, it should go without saying that we can't retreat into some reinterpretation of the planet as a new world for us. These projects are doomed to fail from the outset. Beyond that, we can't even reorient ourselves as being on the side of the world, or an us for the world orientation. We cannot simply make nature our new God and seek to serve it humbly in hopes that it will reward us for faithful service. In Thacker's terms, we can't do this because, if anything, the apparent prevalence of natural disasters and global pandemics indicates that we are not on the side of the world, but that the world is against us. But even this is too anthropocentric of a view, as if the world harbored some misanthropic vendetta against humanity. It would be more accurate, and more horrific in a sense, to say that the world is indifferent to us as human beings. Indeed, the core problematic in climate change discourse is the extent to which human beings are an issue at all. On the one hand, we as human beings are the problem. On the other hand, at a planetary level, of the Earth's deep time, nothing could be more insignificant than the human. While it may seem to be all doom and gloom, a proverbial black pill, after this passage, Thacker scratches the surface of what a positive project could look like going forward. Where a Christian mystic would aim to split the self away from the world, we must reject notions of self and the world. If mysticism, historically speaking, aims for the total union of the division between the self and world, then mysticism today would have to devolve upon the radical disjunction and indifference of self and the world. To illustrate how this could be done, Thacker draws on Keiji Nishitani, a Kyoto school philosopher heavily influenced by his time studying thinkers such as Martin Heidegger. Thacker outlines how Nishitani emulates Nietzsche in his diagnosis of the problem of nihilism in contemporary society, where some thought, and still think, that God could be a firm foundation upon which we could base all values. It turns out that God is dead. This results in a nihilism where something is discovered to, in actuality, be a nothing. This is our confrontation with the planet. This is where we realize the world is an empty pit that we attempt to fill with our idealized fantasies. But instead of isolating the venue of nihilism in the death of God, Nishitani locates it in the waning of both religion and science as places where we shall find firm foundations of value and meaning. Like Nietzsche, for Nishitani, the way forward isn't to attempt to retreat back to some firm foundation, whether it be found in science or religion. The way beyond nihilism is through it. To illustrate how this is done, Nishitani makes reference to the Buddhist concept sunyata, which would translate as nothingness or emptiness. While in English these words don't offer us much, Nishitani uses them in contrast with relative nothingness, predicated on the absence of being, and urges us to think of absolute nothingness. Thacker quotes Nishitani describing it in the following terms. Emptiness, in the sense of sunyata, is emptiness only when it empties itself even of the standpoint that represents it as something that is emptiness. Once you conceive sunyata, notions of self and world themselves become untenable, indistinct, and groundless. Paradoxically, the way to save the world is to jettison it. Our only hope in preventing the world we know and love from becoming a planet is to sublimate the world, the earth, and the planet into some new notion. Hopefully, one free from the hazards rendered from our contemporary paradigm. Thanks for watching. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe for future videos. Feel free to leave a comment as well. If it really meant a lot to you and you'd like to help me produce more, check out my Patreon. Subscribing will give you early access to content as well as other benefits, link in the description below. Also, check me out on Facebook and Instagram for additional content. Again, thanks for watching.